Today I'm going to be showing you how to build this gallery-like view in Power Pages. It is currently displaying records from a Dataverse table. This table we created in my previous video on building applications for Power Pages using the Web API. If you haven't seen that video, I highly recommend that you go and watch it now. First thing to do is to go to the Make Power Pages Microsoft.com site. This will open the Power Pages Development Studio in your particular environment. Now you might get a log on first. I'm already logged in, so all I need to do now is open the edit. We'll open the site that we worked on last time. This video, like I said, is carrying on from our previous video, and we won't cover any of the concepts that we covered in that video. So if you haven't seen it, go watch it now. The first thing we need to do is create a new page. I'm going to call this page our gallery view. And we're not going to add anything new. We won't be adding any of these components to the page. We're going to be going straight into Visual Studio Code. First off, let's close Copilot because we won't be needing that. And you can see it's opened our HTML file for our gallery view page. We also have these two other files. We've got a JS file and a CSS file that belong to this particular page, and this is where we're going to insert all of our code and HTML and styling for our page today, for our gallery view. Now this particular solution is pretty straightforward, pretty simple, and it's really about 50-50 JavaScript and 50% JavaScript and 50% CSS for this solution. We're going to be inserting all of our new HTML within this div, or contained within this div container. So we don't need to delete anything from the page. We're just going to be putting all of our new content within this div. Now, first off, we want a h1 tag, and we're just going to say leave forms. So we'll have the h1 tag display leave forms, and then we want to create. Next thing we do is create a div for our headings. Give this div an ID. I'm going to call this gal headings. This will be the headings for our gallery, and I'll just be creating 4 divs because our gallery is going to have 4 columns. So there'll be 4 divs. I'm giving them a class of gallery heading. We haven't created this class yet, so don't worry about that just yet. We'll get to that very soon. So each of our headings for our gallery are in each of these divs. So we've got submitted by, date from, date to, and medical. And these are the fields from our Dataverse table that we want to display in our gallery. Finally, we want to have a div that is just there to create a border or a line underneath our gallery headings, and this will span across the 4 columns to create like a single line underneath our headings, and it just makes it look a bit nicer. So I'm just applying a direct style to this div because it's the only time that I use this style. Okay, so that's our structure for our headings. Then we need a div that is going to contain our actual gallery. And in fact, I am going to use 2 divs. The first div, I'm going to give an ID of div container. So I'm calling it gal container. And then inside of this, I want to create another div, which is where I will actually render my gallery. And I'll call this gallery. I'm also going to give this a direct style. Now I could do this within CSS, but sometimes I like mixing it up like this just because if I'm looking at the code directly, it's just more obvious what styles are applied here. So if this is not something I'm going to be reusing, I tend to use an inline style, but in the end, it's really a personal choice if you do all the styling in your CSS or you do apply some inline style. Just bear in mind that the inline style is the last to cascade, so this will always overwrite what's in the CSS file. Okay, so that's our gallery, and that is pretty much all the HTML we're going to need today. So like I said, this solution is mostly built in JavaScript and CSS. So let's do the CSS next. So we've got the gallery view.css file open, and in here I'm first going to put some CSS for our gallery headings, and you can see here I've used a hash in front of the gal headings name. So this is not a class I'm declaring here. I'm referencing the ID directly by putting a hash in front of the name of the container. So I'm declaring this, or I'm styling this as a grid. So I'm saying I want the gal headings to be a CSS grid. And here it's got 4 columns, and each column, these are effectively, I'm declaring how much of a percentage, I guess, each column takes. So I'm saying here that make 4 columns of equal width. So it'll just take up the entire width of the grid, and the grid will be 4 columns wide. The last parameter I'm giving here, or the last property I'm giving here, I should say, is gap, and that just says put a 10 pixel gap between each column, and this means that you're not going to get the columns butting up right next to each other. So if you've got a lot of content within a column, you don't want it sort of touching the next column start, so it just makes it look a bit neater. Okay, so the next bit of styling I'm going to insert here is I'm going to declare a CSS class, and this class is called grid row. So effectively each line of the gallery is its own grid. So this is where I declare, or I define what that each row of the gallery is going to be. And you can see it's quite similar to the headings, or it's identical, because we want our headings to pretty much line up with the columns inside of inside of the gallery in each row of the gallery. So next I'm going to add this CSS property, and it's just saying grid row before and after content none. So when we do this, it just means that it doesn't try to add, or it doesn't add any additional fields before and after, like insert fields before or after in our grid. We purely just want to show our 4 columns lined up across the grid, and we don't want any other fields being inserted in our grid. Now, the next property I'm going to define, CSS property, will be gal container, and again we're using a hash here. So gal container is the ID of the, if you remember, it's our initial container that our gallery is sitting in. And why we want to do this, because we want a background of our gallery to be different from, we want the background to look a bit different from the gallery itself, because we want to do sort of like a box background and with curved edges. Now you might be thinking, why don't I just put that styling on the gallery itself? I do that because I don't want the gallery to sort of grow beyond a certain size. I want the gallery to sit on the page, and then if the gallery grows larger than that, if I want to display more records than are possible on the height of the gallery, then I want a scroll bar to appear so we can scroll up and down. So I want to fix the size of the container that's displaying the gallery, and then the gallery will just scroll if it grows beyond that. So here you can see I'm putting a max height of 800 pixels, so it's fairly short, it's not that high. and it should fit on most screens. You can see here I've also set the overflow to auto overflow Y because I do want to have overflow. And these rest of these properties are fairly self-explanatory. We've got things like border radius and box shadow. So I'm putting a tiny little shadow on it and setting the background color. Sorry, don't mean for that to keep popping up. Setting the background color here to be slightly different from the background so we can see, makes it stand out a little. So the next CSS property I'm setting is the item. And this is a class. You can see it's a dot property. So we're creating a class here, and I'm just setting the properties of the div that's going to actually contain the data coming from the coming from Dataverse, and we're just setting this to be flex, and it's going to justify the content, so it's going to just make everything line up and look okay inside of that div, regardless of where it's sitting on the page and how big the page is. Here again, we're just doing the same thing for gallery heading. So this isn't gallery headings, this is a class of gallery heading, and again, this is just the content that is being displayed inside of the div that is displaying the heading for each column. Now the last two properties I'll put up at the same time. And what these two properties do are the alternating colors inside of our gallery for each row. So we've got grid row here, and remember grid row is the grid, is each line of the gallery. And I'm just using this nth child selector here so I can select which row I am coloring. So I'm doing if you can see there, if you look at the top, the first one, I'm doing every even row, but also all the divs underneath the even row. So that is all of our CSS that we need. So let's save that. So just hitting Control S. Now save that. I'm not sure if I saved my HTML, so let's save that as well. So the last thing we need to do is work on our JavaScript. So if you watched the last video, I know I'm harping on this a little bit, but if you watched the last video, and you kind of need to really understand why we do this, but we have a helper function that is pretty much going to be a part of every single Power Pages application that you build. Build like this, I should say. So whenever we're using the web API, you need to use this helper function to enable our connection, enable a way to be able to read data and do all of our CRUD operations on our Dataverse tables. It just makes things a lot simpler than trying to work out authentication and all that stuff. This takes care of all of that for us, which is really great. So let's just put that in there. And I do show examples of this, and I have provided an example of this in my previous video as well. But here it is on the screen again. So if you need to take a look at this, you can pause the screen here, or again, you can go check out my previous video and where I do have a link to my GitHub. So I'll probably leave a link to the GitHub repository in the description on this video as well. So one of the things you see here right at the bottom, after it's done this document ready, which is a part of jQuery, and jQuery is also automatically loaded on Power Pages pages, so Power Pages sites, so you don't need to worry about loading that, it's already loaded. And we can leverage this document ready function that comes from jQuery. Now after this is finished, I've created my own function called startup. So we don't have startup created yet, so let's put that in. All that startup does, and I like having a separate function here that the document ready calls at the end, because if I need to put anything more in here, I can. I don't have to sort of start tracing through the logic of my program. I know I have a startup program, so the first thing I'm doing is loading records. And then from there, if I need to do something else, I can just put it in there. If I want to do something before I load records, I just put it before load records. So this makes things a lot easier. So we need a function. We're calling a function called load records. We don't have a function called load records yet, so let's create one. I'm going to go through this function manually so we can understand exactly what it's doing. So that's our load records. So first thing we want to do is call the web API function that we've established down here. So now that we've established this, it's available for any of our functions within our program. Let's just close that. Here's our web API call. And in here, we've got some parameters we need to set. First we want to do is type, and we want to do a get because we're doing a get call. The next parameter is the URL that we're calling. Now this will be different from for your site. And my URL is this. So let's break this down just quickly. So what this does is this will call this from our site that we've created. So we're doing the root of our site underscore API. So all of our API calls will be in this URL / and here's where we put the list name that we're, or the, I guess the Dataverse table name that we're connecting to. And then we need to pass some OData query parameters here. So the way we initiate that is put a question mark, and then each parameter, each OData parameter will start with a $sign. So because we're using created by is a specific column inside of our Dataverse table. So created by is a lookup to another table in Dataverse called system user or sysuser. So we can't, when we do our query on our table, when we do our web service call, we need to tell it that we also want it to, a part of this part of this query, we want the data for this created by to be queried from the other table, the connected table, or the lookup table that that this leave forms table has, because created by is effectively a lookup to this system users table. So sounds complicated, but really all we need to do is include this expand parameter. And we need to say created by. So we want to expand the created by, which is our created by field. And in brackets, we just put $select equals full name. We're using this field, full name, and we want full name from the sys users. So basically we're just saying created by, which is a lookup to another record, and within that record we want just to display full name. Now the way we add additional OData parameters is we use an ampersand. So I also want to say I want to add a new parameter, and that parameter is going to be top equals 500. Now what this does is it says just return the top 500 records. So don't return all the records you can from Dataverse from this table. I only want to see the top 500. Now this is a really good practice, because ultimately in the end, this web call can only return a maximum of 50,000 records, or yes, I believe it's 50,000 is the max that it can do. So you really need to sort of think about how you're displaying the records and what the business requirement is, or what the requirement is behind this. Now, clearly, if you got more than 50,000 records in your table, and it's important for users to be able to see more than 50,000, then you need to start thinking about filtering your data source and adding a search option to your page, because the more records you're going to return back from this, obviously the slower your page is going to get and the more unusable it's going to get and more dependent on how fast your connection is. So 50,000 records is quite a lot for a single query. So yes, you really sort of need to think about that. And in my business case, I am thinking, well, by default, I just want to show the top 500. So top 500 leave forms is quite a lot. Now, if you don't specify the order that this query is happening at, then it's just going to go the top 500 from the very first record in the table. Now, I don't necessarily want to do that because that doesn't really seem like a very useful way to look at the data, because I'm always just going to be looking at the top 500 records. Now, if there's lots of leave forms going in, the 500 records might get exceeded fairly quickly, and then I'm always just going to be looking at the same first 500 records in the database. What then is a good idea is then to order those by default to have some kind of order or sorting of that data before it's displayed in the gallery. That way, you're always going to be showing perhaps the newer records or the last 500 rather than always the first 500. Now, you could do the last 500 by just setting the created by, so always filter by, always order by created by in your database filter or your gallery. But in this instance, I've thought, well, it might be more useful by default to order them by the date from. So these records are always going to be ordered in descending order by date from. So they're always going to show the very latest or the very newest records that the date from my leave date from is set. And that way you're always showing like the top 500 based on that query. Just make sure we put a comma. Next parameter is just setting the content type to application/JSON. And in here, we have our success function. So we just define what happens when our query is successful. So what do we want to do when this query is successfully returns back data based on our query or based on our OData query? Well, I already know what the structure is of the data being returned back from our API. I know that it returns back an array of records, and the array is called value. So you can see here our function, our success function, returns an object called res, which is short for result. You can really call this anything you like. And I know this is an array. So let's just, we can use some JavaScript here, and we can use the for each function. So for each record inside of this array value that's returned back from this result object, we want to run a function on each record. Let's bring this up a little. So what do we want to do here? Well, we basically want to populate our gallery with the results from each record inside of this res object or inside of this value array that's in our res object. So let's define a variable first. Let's just say, let's create a row, and we want that row to be a div. And after we've declared this, we've created this div object called row. We want to set its class name to grid row. And remember, we created this class in our CSS file. Right, so that creates our entire row. Now inside of this row, we want to create the div items, which is the item for each grid column. Each column in the grid, we need a div that we are going to put our data in, our 4 columns that we're going to display from our OData query on our Dataverse table. So let's declare another variable and let's create another div object, which is going to be our first column. And just like we did with the row, we're going to give this a class of item, and this item again is the CSS class that we defined before in our CSS file. Next, we're going to set the text content of the item. So we're inside of the div, we're going to set the text content to be the record, which is, remember, we're running a function on each one of these records inside of this value array. So each record, so the record and created by full name. So our first column is going to be full name. And then all we need to do here is append that as a child object to our row. So remember, item is a div, and we've set some properties on that div. And then now we're appending it to row, which is another div that we have given the class of grid rows. So grid row was our grid, is our div that is defined as our grid, and these are our columns that are inside of that grid. So we're appending it inside of to the row object as a child div. Now we're going to need to do this 4 times, 3 more times for each column. So here we're creating another div. We're assigning again the class of item, but this time we're using the date from field, and this is just the name of the date from column, just like this is the name of the created by column. So here, because this was a lookup to another table, that's why we've got an additional property on this object. But date from is just coming from our leave form table. And record, so we got this field called date from, and we're running a function called format date. We haven't created that function yet, but I will in a second. So don't worry about that, but this just formats it in a format that I want to display the date from. Otherwise, this date just comes back as a big date string. I'll show you that function in a second. The next column is, so again, we're creating, for the next part, we're creating another div. We're setting again the class name to be item, and for the text content this time, we're setting it to date to, and we're appending it to the row. So now row has 3 divs appended to it. So we've effectively created an outer div that is the row, and it is a grid, CSS grid, which is, that's row, is the CSS grid. If we look at our CSS, remember grid row is a grid. An item is just a div displayed as a flex. So in here, we want one more column, and we're just going to display, we've got another field in our leave form that, if you remember back to the first video, you just set if your leave form or your leave reason is medical or not. So this again is just another field coming from the data, well, coming from our form that is stored in our Dataverse table that is just called medical. And you can see I've just used a little if-then shorthand because the data is stored as Boolean inside of the Dataverse table. So it's just stored as true or false, but I wanted it to be yes or no displayed in the gallery. So all this says is if this is true, then display yes, Otherwise, display a no. Last thing I do is append this to the row. So all 4 columns have been now appended to row as child objects. So there we've got an outer div and then we've got 4 inner divs. The outer div has got a class of row, and that is the grid. And then the 4 divs underneath it are the columns. So the grid has been defined as a 4-column grid, and this is just the way CSS. We're telling CSS to render this as a grid, or you could think of it as a table, and you could probably have used a HTML table for this as well, but grids are a more modern way to display a table-like structure in HTML, and they're better, they're easier. So the very last thing that you want to do, well, we need to append. So our gallery here is our div. If we go back to our HTML, our gallery is our top level div here that we want to push our gallery items into. So each row of this div gallery is going to be a grid that is the row for each the row that we're displaying in the gallery is its own grid. And so each time we iterate through this if statement for each, we're just appending this new item from this query into the gallery. And that's all that's all the code we need to render that gallery out. So just one last thing that I need to put in here, because I have called this function called format date. So this is a really simple function here, and you may or may not want to use this, but this function takes a date string. So we're passing, we go down to our load records here. You can see we've wrapped this value coming from our OData record, our JSON record, sorry. We're passing it to format date. So here's our date string coming into format date, and we're just creating new date object. So we're converting that to an actual JavaScript date so that we can do date functions on it. And as long as this is a valid date string, this should work fine. You might want to put some validation or checking on that and some error checking, but for simplicity's sake and for the length of this video, I've sort of left most of that stuff out just to give you the bare bones of how to build this. Obviously, if you're going to production or you're rolling this out into production, you'd probably want to do a lot more validation and checking on each step of this process. You can see here, even our loads record function doesn't capture any errors. It's just doing something on success. So this is something you would also probably want to add in production. So our format date's pretty simple. Just creates a date object based on the date string, then grabs the day, grabs the month out of that using these different functions, grabs the year, sort of separates them out into day, month, year, and then creates a new string with just this day /month /year and returns that formatted date. So when that comes back to here, it just sets the item text content to be the formatted date string based on what we read from the Dataverse table. So if we save all that and we go back to our Power Pages, we got our gallery view open. We just want to hit sync to make sure our gallery view page that we created is got all that new code that we just updated. And then we just want to click preview. And here's our gallery displaying our records sorted in date to descending order. See the very last one that was submitted on the 13th of the 11th, 2023. And this is our data now displayed on our page, exactly like the demo that I showed you at the beginning of this video. Now, the logical next steps for this would be to add a search box, because we're like I said at the beginning, we we want to sort of limit the amount of records that we display up front. Now, someone might want to look for something historical, or look for a particular record, or look for a range of records that maybe have a date to or a date from for a certain date. They might be searching for a particular leave form from a certain person, or maybe just wanting to show records that are medical only and not really concerned about non-medical related leave forms. So maybe not as important for this particular example, but with a gallery that you're building or a view to your data, this might be really important for users to be able to search, and I'm guessing it probably will be. So the next steps would be to create some kind of search option, and perhaps even making these headings here clickable, so you can then click on sort order just by clicking these headings. That's typical behavior for galleries. Now, if that's something you're interested in, make sure you leave a comment and you let me know in the comments section below, because without those comments, I really have not a lot to go on to know sort of your interests in what you would like to see next out of this sort of mini project, this mini Power Pages project that we're working on. If you let me know what you'd like to see next, I can then create another video for you to do that. But for now, I'm glad you've made it to the end, and I really sincerely hope that you got everything you wanted to out of this video. I'll see you next time. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, click the like button, hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all the latest content, and comment something in the comments section below. I thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.